There is something strange about the modern kitchen. It has never been cleaner, never been brighter, never been more convenient. Food can sit on a shelf for months without changing. Milk can travel across cities without souring. Bread can stay soft inside a plastic bag for weeks. Vegetables can be washed, sealed, shipped, scanned, refrigerated, and stacked under perfect white lights. And yet, somewhere along the way, something quiet disappeared. Not flavor exactly, not calories, not even nutrition in the simple way we usually talk about it. What disappeared was life. For most of human history, food was not expected to remain frozen in time. It changed. It breathed. It softened. It soured. It bubbled in clay jars and wooden barrels. It waited in dark corners of ancient kitchens while salt, water, air, and invisible organisms slowly transformed it into something new. The people who made these foods did not use words like microbiome. They did not speak of lactobacillus, organic acids, enzymes, or bioactive compounds. A shepherd in the hills of the ancient Near East did not need a laboratory to understand that milk left in a skin bag became easier to keep. A family preparing cabbage for winter did not need a microscope to know that salt and thyme could protect them from hunger. A baker feeding a sourdough starter before sunrise did not know the chemistry of wild yeast, but he knew that slow bread behaved differently from rushed bread. And now, thousands of years later, modern science is beginning to give names to what ancient people learned through hunger, patience, and observation. This video is for educational and documentary purposes only. It is not medical advice, and no single food can replace professional care, medication, or a balanced lifestyle. If you have a medical condition, allergies, or dietary restrictions, always speak with a qualified health professional. But, as a story of food, history, and the human body, fermented foods offer one of the most fascinating bridges between the ancient world and the modern one, because before food became sterile, packaged, flavored, stabilized, and designed to last forever, it was often alive. In this quiet journey, we are going to explore the ancient fermented foods that traveled through deserts, monasteries, mountain villages, fishing towns, royal tables, and ordinary family kitchens. Some were made from cabbage, some from milk, some from soybeans, apples, garlic, honey, grains, tea, or beets. Some were eaten by farmers before dawn. Some were carried by sailors across oceans. Some were placed on humble tables not because they were fashionable, but because they worked well enough to survive generation after generation. And the deeper we go, the more one pattern begins to appear. Ancient people may not have understood the invisible world inside food, but they knew how to live with it. And perhaps the most important question is not why they ate food that was still alive. The real question is why we stopped. Number 1. The modern kitchen forgot something ancient. Walk into almost any modern kitchen at night, when the house is quiet and the refrigerator hums softly in the dark, and you can see the story of our age written in small containers and sealed packages. There are cartons designed to stay fresh as long as possible, jars that never bubble, bread that does not dry, crack, sour, or change, sauces sharpened with vinegar instead of thyme, vegetables preserved by heat until every living thing inside them has been silenced. Everything is stable, everything is predictable, everything is safe for shipping, stacking, scanning, and storing. And in many ways, this has been a miracle. Modern food systems have helped feed cities larger than ancient kings could have imagined. They have reduced many dangers that once haunted every household. Spoiled milk, contaminated water, moldy grain, rotten meat, and hunger during winter were not romantic problems. They were real threats. But convenience has a shadow, because the ancient kitchen was not built around the idea of stopping change. It was built around guiding change. A clay jar in a cool room was not just storage. It was a quiet collaboration. Salt slowed down what needed to be slowed. Water created the right environment. The surface of a vegetable carried invisible life. The air carried wild yeast. The milk from a goat or cow began to shift almost as soon as it left the animal. Grain mixed with water woke up. Honey, garlic, fruit, cabbage, soybeans, tea leaves, and beets all had the ability to become something more than they were at the beginning. The people who lived with these foods did not think of them as trends. No one in an ancient village was making sauerkraut because it was a superfood. No fisherman was drinking a fermented tonic because a wellness magazine told him to. No mother buried a clay pot of kimchi because she wanted a fashionable gut health routine. They did it because food had to survive. Winter was coming. Roads were long. Harvests were uncertain. Milk soured quickly. Grain could be hard on the stomach. Vegetables would rot if left alone. And the human body, working from sunrise to darkness, needed food that could nourish without wasting anything. So ancient people learned one of the oldest lessons in food history. If you could not stop nature from changing your food, perhaps you could ask nature to change it in the right direction. That is the quiet genius of fermentation. It does not freeze food in place, it transforms it. Cabbage becomes sharper, deeper, and more durable. Milk becomes yogurt, kefir, or cheese. Flour and water become sourdough. Soybeans become miso or natto. Apples become vinegar. Tea becomes kombucha. Beets become a ruby-colored brine. Garlic softens inside honey until its sharpness turns mellow and strange. And each transformation carries a story. Some stories begin in the desert, some in mountain villages, some in monastic kitchens, some in the simple hunger of ordinary families trying to make food last just a little longer. Modern science is now studying these foods through the language of bacteria, enzymes, organic acids, prebiotics, polyphenols, and the microbiome. But long before those words existed, people were already watching. They watched which foods kept through winter, which ones settled the stomach, which ones made a heavy meal feel lighter, which ones could be carried on a journey, which ones seemed to belong on the table every day, not because they were magical, but because life felt more balanced when they were there. And that is where this journey begins. Not with a miracle cure, not with a secret that modern medicine has hidden, but with a simple idea that humanity may have forgotten too quickly. Food was once alive, and for thousands of years, we knew how to live beside it. Number 2. Salt, time, and the intelligence of the living world. Before there were refrigerators, before sealed plastic, before expiration dates printed in black ink, there was salt. A handful of it could mean the difference between a harvest saved and a harvest lost. It could protect fish by the sea, cabbage in the north, olives around the Mediterranean, and vegetables in small farms where winter arrived like a closed door. But salt alone was never the whole story. Salt did something more subtle. It created a boundary. It made the world difficult for the wrong microbes and welcoming for the right ones. In that narrow space, something remarkable could happen. The natural bacteria, already living on vegetables, grains, fruits, and in milk, could begin their slow work. They fed. They multiplied. They produced acids. They changed flavor, texture, smell, and chemistry. They made food sour not because it was spoiled, but because it had entered a different state of preservation. To the ancient eye, it may have seemed mysterious. A pot of cabbage left in brine did not rot the way cabbage normally rotted. Milk left in the right vessel did not simply become spoiled. It thickened, sharpened, and became useful. Dough left overnight rose, with a power no hand had placed inside it. Tea, sugar, and a strange floating culture became a tart drink that seemed halfway between food and medicine, ritual and refreshment. Today we can describe some of what was happening. Lactic acid bacteria can help create an acidic environment that discourages many unwanted organisms. Wild yeasts can release gases that lift dough. Certain fermentation processes can reduce compounds in grains and legumes that make minerals harder to absorb. Some fermented foods may support a more diverse gut microbiome when eaten as part of a varied diet. Others contain organic acids, bioactive peptides, or plant compounds that become more available after fermentation. But the important thing is not that every fermented food does the same thing. They do not. A sourdough loaf is not the same as kefir. Kimchi is not the same as miso. Natto is not the same as apple cider vinegar. Each one is its own small ecosystem, shaped by climate, vessel, ingredient, temperature, season, and human habit. This is why ancient food traditions are so fascinating. They were not designed in laboratories, but they were refined through repetition. A grandmother taught a mother taught a daughter. A village learned which jar worked best, how much salt was enough, when the smell was right, when the bubbling had slowed, when the food was ready. In one place, clay pots were buried in the earth. In another, barrels were kept below deck on ships. In another, milk was carried in animal skins across mountains until it became something new. These traditions were not random. They were memory, repeated until it became culture. And what modern science is beginning to notice is that some of these old methods did more than preserve food. They changed the relationship between food and the body. Fermentation can make certain foods easier to digest. It can create new flavors that signal complexity and depth. It can add living cultures in foods that remain raw and unpasteurized. It can produce acids that interact with digestion. It can help unlock nutrients that were present but less available in the original ingredient. Again, none of this means fermented foods are magic. A jar of sauerkraut does not replace medical care. Kefir does not erase a poor lifestyle. Vinegar does not cancel out an unhealthy diet. And not every fermented food is suitable for every person. Those who are pregnant, immunocompromised, allergic, sensitive to histamines, or managing medical conditions should be thoughtful and speak with a qualified professional when needed. But as part of the human food story, fermentation deserves its ancient reputation because it shows us a kind of wisdom that is easy to overlook. The old world did not always fight nature. Sometimes it gave nature a vessel, a little salt, a little darkness, and enough time to become useful. And the next foods show how far that wisdom traveled. Number 3. The ancient foods that traveled across civilizations. Some foods belong to one place. Fermented foods rarely do. They appear almost everywhere, as if humanity kept discovering the same secret under different skies. In the cold regions of Europe, cabbage met salt and became sauerkraut. In Korea, Napa cabbage, radish, garlic, ginger, chili, and seafood became kimchi, sealed into clay jars and held through the seasons. In the Caucasus Mountains, milk met kefir grains and became a tart, living drink passed from household to household. In the Middle East, Central Asia, Greece, and beyond, milk thickened into yogurt and strained into labneh. In ancient bakeries, flour and water gathered wild yeast and bacteria, becoming bread with a soul of its own. These foods were separated by language, religion, geography, and empire. But they were united by one principle. Let the food change slowly, and it may become more useful than it was before. Imagine a ship leaving port with barrels tucked below deck. The sailors do not have fresh gardens waiting for them in the middle of the ocean. They have salted foods, dried foods, preserved foods, and if they are fortunate, something sour and alive enough to keep the memory of green plants inside the body. Imagine a Korean winter before electricity. The fields are frozen. The air is hard. But beneath the ground, inside heavy earthenware jars, vegetables continue their transformation. The family has food not because nature stopped, but because someone knew how to guide it. Imagine a mountain village where milk is too precious to waste. Fresh milk is fragile. Fermented milk is more forgiving. It can be shared, carried, stored, poured, and returned to day after day. Imagine a baker before sunrise, touching yesterday's starter, smelling its sharpness, feeling whether it is ready. The dough is alive before the fire ever reaches it. The bread is not rushed. It belongs to the rhythm of the house. The old world did not separate food from place. Sauerkraut tasted like winter fields. Kimchi tasted like clay jars, sea salt, and family labor. Kefir tasted like animals, mountains, and movement. Sourdough tasted like grain, air, water, and time. Modern food often tries to erase this. It wants the same flavor in every city, the same texture in every package, the same shelf life in every store. Fermented food resists that. It remembers where it came from. And perhaps that is part of why people are returning to it now. Not only because of probiotics, not only because of gut health, not only because research suggests fermented foods may support microbial diversity when included in a balanced diet, but because these foods make us feel that food is not just fuel. It is a relationship. Take sauerkraut. At its simplest, it is cabbage and salt, but inside that simplicity is a world. The cabbage is shredded and pressed until its own juices rise. Salt pulls water from the leaves. The brine covers the vegetable. Oxygen is pushed away. The right bacteria begin to thrive. Days pass. The smell changes. The texture softens. A plain winter vegetable becomes sour, bright, and alive. Or kimchi. It is not merely fermented cabbage. It is a carefully built environment. Garlic brings prebiotic fibers. Ginger brings warmth. Chili brings fire. Radish brings crunch. Fish sauce or salted seafood, in traditional versions, adds depth and umami. The clay pot breathes differently than glass or plastic. The season matters. The hands matter. The household recipe matters. Or kefir. The grains look almost like tiny cauliflower florets, pale and strange. But they are not grains in the ordinary sense. They are communities of bacteria and yeast living together. When placed in milk, they transform it into something tart, slightly effervescent and complex. Compared with many commercial yogurts, traditional kefir can contain a wider variety of microbial species, though the exact profile depends on the grains and preparation. Or yogurt itself. Before it became a sweet cup with fruit syrup at the bottom, yogurt was a practical food. It was milk made safer, thicker, and more durable. Strained yogurt became dense and satisfying. Mixed with herbs, olive oil, or bread, it could anchor a meal. It did not need to shout, it simply belonged. And then there is sourdough, perhaps the most symbolic of them all. Because bread is one of the oldest human foods. And sourdough reminds us that even bread was once a collaboration with invisible life. Long fermentation can change the structure of dough. It can develop flavor, lower pH, and may improve digestibility for some people when compared with quickly made bread. It does not make wheat safe for everyone, especially not for people with celiac disease. But it does show how time changes grain in ways speed cannot easily imitate. This is one of the quiet patterns of ancient food. Time was not an inconvenience. Time was an ingredient. And by the time we arrive at the science of the microbiome, this old habit of waiting begins to look less primitive and more profound. Number 4. When ancient wisdom meets the microbiome, for thousands of years, people ate fermented foods without knowing they were feeding an invisible world inside themselves. They knew the taste. They knew the smell. They knew the feeling of a meal that sat gently in the stomach, or a sour food that seemed to wake up the appetite before a long day of work. They knew that some foods kept better after they changed. They knew that milk could become more useful when it thickened, that cabbage could become more valuable when it soured, that bread could become deeper when it was allowed to rise slowly through the night. But they did not know the word microbiome. They did not know that the human gut is home to trillions of microorganisms, living in a complex relationship with digestion, immune function, metabolism, and even the signals that travel between the gut and the brain. They did not know that different bacteria produce different compounds, or that diversity inside this inner ecosystem may be one of the quiet markers of resilience. They did not need to know the names. They only needed to notice the pattern. Modern science now gives us a new language for that pattern. It suggests that certain fermented foods, especially those that remain raw and unpasteurized, may help introduce beneficial microbes into the digestive system. It suggests that fermentation can create organic acids, bioactive compounds, and changes in food structure that may support digestion and nutrient availability. It suggests that the food we eat is not only feeding us, but also feeding the microbial communities that live with us. And that idea changes the way we see an ancient bowl of food. A small serving of sauerkraut is no longer just cabbage. It is cabbage transformed by lactic acid bacteria. A cup of kefir is no longer just sour milk. It is a living culture, shaped by bacteria and yeast. A spoonful of miso is no longer just salty paste. It is soybeans and grains slowly broken down by koji, thyme, and microbial activity. A slice of real sourdough is no longer just flour and water. It is grain altered by a long conversation between wild yeast, bacteria, and the baker's patience. The ancient world saw the surface. Modern science is beginning to see the hidden architecture underneath. But this is where we have to be careful, because once science gives old foods new language, the modern world often turns them into exaggerated promises. Suddenly, every jar becomes a cure. Every ancient habit becomes a secret. Every fermented food becomes a miracle waiting to be sold. That is not the lesson. The lesson is quieter. Fermented foods may support health as part of a broader pattern. They may contribute to microbial diversity. They may help some people digest certain foods more comfortably. They may bring acids, enzymes, fibers, and plant compounds into the diet in forms that are different from the original raw ingredients. But they are not replacements for medical care. They do not erase disease. They do not undo everything else we eat, drink, breathe, and experience. Ancient people did not treat them as shortcuts. They treated them as part of daily life. A little sour cabbage with a meal, a spoon of yogurt beside bread, a bowl of miso soup in the morning, a piece of aged cheese carried on a road, a cup of fermented milk shared at a table. a pickle eaten not as a challenge but as a normal companion to heavier food. This may be the most important difference between ancient food wisdom and modern wellness culture. The ancient world did not usually isolate one food and worship it. It built rhythms. Fermented foods appeared alongside whole grains, beans, herbs, fish, olives, vegetables, seasonal fruits, and long hours of physical labor. They were part of a pattern, not a product. They were eaten in small amounts, repeatedly, over years. They belonged to families and seasons, not to trends. The microbiome seems to respond to patterns too. Not one heroic meal, not one dramatic cleanse, not one expensive bottle promising transformation, but repeated signals. Fiber, variety, plants, less ultra-processed food, time outdoors, rest, movement, and perhaps, in the right body in the right amount, traditional fermented foods that bring sourness and life back to the plate. There is something humbling about this. The body is not a machine into which we simply insert nutrients. It is more like a landscape. A landscape can be damaged by neglect, but it is restored slowly by many small conditions working together. Soil does not become rich from one seed. A forest does not grow from one rain. And the gut, this inner garden, does not become balanced because of one fashionable food. It is tended. That is what ancient people understood, even without microscopes. They understood tending. They tended fires. They tended animals. They tended fields. They tended dough. They tended jars. They tended the slow, invisible work that happened when food was given the right conditions. And now, when we speak of the microbiome, maybe we are rediscovering that same old verb. To tend, to care for what is alive before it disappears. And this brings us to the foods that were never meant to be trends at all. They were survival foods. They were winter foods. They were road foods. They were the quiet technologies that helped ordinary people endure. Number 5. The foods that were not trends but survival. It is easy to look at fermented foods today and see them through the bright glass of modern wellness. A bottle on a refrigerated shelf. A label with elegant typography. A promise of gut health. A small jar placed carefully beside a smoothie, a salad, or a breakfast bowl. But that is not where these foods began. They began in hunger. They began in the problem every ancient household understood. How do you keep food from disappearing before the next harvest? How do you preserve milk when there is no refrigerator? How do you make soybeans more useful? How do you keep vegetables through winter? How do you make grain easier to eat? How do you carry nourishment across a road, a mountain, a sea, a desert? The answer was rarely glamorous. It was practical, repetitive, humble. Miso began as a way to transform soybeans and grains into something dense, salty, and long-lasting. In Japan, the slow work of koji turned simple ingredients into a paste with remarkable depth. A spoonful could flavor a pot of soup. A small amount could bring warmth to rice, vegetables, and broth. Long before anyone spoke of enzymes in the modern sense, cooks knew that miso was not just saltiness. It was thyme made edible. There is a quiet beauty in that. A dark miso aging through the seasons does not hurry. It deepens. The color changes. The aroma becomes richer. Proteins are broken down into amino acids, creating umami, that deep, savory taste that feels almost like memory on the tongue. Fermentation may also reduce some compounds in soybeans that make minerals harder to absorb, which helps explain why traditional preparation matters so much. But even here, the wisdom is gentle. Miso is not something to boil violently if you want to preserve its delicate qualities. Traditional cooks often stirred into hot, not aggressively boiling, broth. The old method protected what the long fermentation had built. Then there is natto. For many people encountering it for the first time, natto is difficult to understand. It is sticky, stringy, pungent, and unapologetically alive. It does not try to be mild. It does not perform elegance in the way Western food often expects. But in Japan, natto has long been an ordinary breakfast food, eaten with rice, mustard, soy sauce, or green onion. Its power is not in beauty. Its power is in strangeness. Natto is made by fermenting soybeans with Bacillus subtilis, a bacterium that transforms the beans and produces compounds that have attracted scientific interest. including nattokinase and vitamin K2. Researchers have studied nattokinase for its relationship to fibrin and circulation, and vitamin K2 for its role in how the body uses calcium. These are serious areas of research, but they should be spoken of carefully. Natto is food, not a replacement for medication, and anyone taking blood thinners or managing cardiovascular conditions should speak with a professional before eating it regularly. Still, as a cultural object, natto teaches something profound. Not all valuable foods are immediately pleasant. Some require a culture to teach the tongue what matters. Kvass tells a different story. In Eastern Europe, kvass was made from rye bread, beets, or other ingredients that could be fermented into a sour, earthy drink. It was not luxurious. It was peasant intelligence in liquid form. Bread that might have gone stale could become a drink. Beets from the soil could become a deep red tonic. Salt, water, and thyme could carry the flavor of the field into a glass. Beet kvass especially has gained attention because beets naturally contain nitrates and betalain pigments. Modern research suggests that dietary nitrates from beets can support nitric oxide production, which plays a role in blood vessel relaxation and oxygen delivery. But again, the ancient story is not that beets were magic. It is that people learned to use what the land gave them, and fermentation made that gift last longer. Then there is fermented garlic and honey. Few preparations feel more like something from an old household than this. A clean jar. Freshly peeled garlic cloves. Raw honey poured slowly over them until the cloves shine under amber light. At first, the garlic is sharp and aggressive. Over weeks, it softens. The honey thins slightly. Bubbles may rise, the cloves darken, mellow, and become almost sweet. Across many traditions, both honey and garlic were valued separately. Honey was treasured not only for sweetness, but because it could keep. Garlic was loved and feared for its intensity. Together, under the right conditions, they become a slow winter preparation, the kind of thing a family might keep on a shelf when cold weather approached. Modern science has studied garlic for compounds such as allicin and honey for its antimicrobial properties, especially in specific medical-grade contexts. But homemade raw honey preparations require care. Raw honey is not appropriate for infants under 1 year old, and people who are pregnant, immunocompromised, or medically vulnerable should be cautious with raw or naturally fermented foods. The old world knew many things. It did not know everything. That distinction matters. Apple cider vinegar with the mother belongs to the same family of survival intelligence. Apples fall in abundance, but abundance is temporary. Fermentation extends the life of the fruit. First, the sugars become alcohol. Then, with oxygen and the right bacteria, alcohol becomes acetic acid. The result is vinegar. Sharp, stable, useful, and almost endlessly practical. In ancient and traditional kitchens, vinegar was not just a salad ingredient. It brightened heavy meals. It preserved vegetables. It sharpened sauces. It cleaned, flavored, and balanced. Today, some studies suggest vinegar taken with carbohydrate-rich meals may modestly reduce post-meal glucose spikes in some people, but it should always be diluted and used thoughtfully. Undiluted vinegar can damage tooth enamel and irritate the throat or stomach. This is the pattern again. The ancient method is useful. The modern exaggeration is dangerous. The real wisdom lives between them, and perhaps that is why these survival foods still fascinate us. They remind us that humans once had a much more intimate relationship with change. A harvest was not secure until it had been dried, salted, fermented, stored, watched, smelled, and tasted. Food was not trusted because it came with a label. It was trusted because someone knew its behavior. That knowledge took generations to build. And in many families, it disappeared in just 1 or 2. When industrial food arrived, it offered something powerful: safety, uniformity, convenience, abundance. These gifts should not be dismissed. But the trade was subtle. We gained foods that could travel farther and last longer, but we lost the daily practice of tending foods that were still alive. We stopped smelling the jar. We stopped feeding the starter. We stopped knowing the difference between sourness created by vinegar and sourness created by fermentation. We stopped asking whether a food had been transformed or merely flavored. And that hidden difference may be the most important part of the entire story. Because two foods can share the same name and have almost nothing in common. One is alive. The other only tastes like it is. Number 6. The hidden difference between dead food and living food. Here is where the story becomes easy to misunderstand. Because in the modern grocery store, two foods can look almost identical while belonging to completely different worlds. Two jars of pickles may sit side by side in a refrigerator. Both are green. Both are sour. Both crunch between the teeth. Both taste like something preserved. But one may have been transformed by living bacteria. The other may simply have been soaked in vinegar. And that difference, quiet as it seems, changes the entire story. A vinegar pickle is not a bad food. It can be delicious. It can be safe, sharp, bright, and useful on a sandwich. But it is not the same as a lacto-fermented pickle, where cucumbers sit in saltwater brine while naturally present bacteria produce lactic acid over time. One is acidified. The other is fermented. The tongue may notice sourness in both, but the body is meeting two different histories. The same is true of sauerkraut. A shelf-stable jar may say sauerkraut on the label. It may contain cabbage, salt, and sour flavor. But if it has been pasteurized to sit unrefrigerated for months or years, the live cultures that once transformed it are no longer alive. Again, this does not make it useless as food. It may still offer fiber and flavor, but it is not the same as raw, refrigerated sauerkraut that continues to carry living cultures. The name stayed. The process changed. And in traditional food, process is everything. This is one of the deepest lessons ancient kitchens can still teach us. They did not define food only by its ingredient list. They defined it by what had happened to it. Milk was not just milk. Was it fresh, soured, cultured, strained, churned, or aged? Grain was not just grain. Was it soaked, sprouted, stone ground, fermented, baked quickly, or left overnight? Soybeans were not just soybeans. Were they boiled and eaten plain, or transformed slowly into miso, tempeh, soy sauce, or natto? Cabbage was not just cabbage. Was it raw, boiled, salted, fermented, stored, or preserved in vinegar? The ancient table understood transformation. The modern label often hides it. This is especially clear with sourdough. In many stores, the word sourdough can mean almost anything. Sometimes it means bread made with a living starter and fermented slowly over many hours. Sometimes it means ordinary commercial yeast bread with sour flavor added. Sometimes it means a loaf that looks rustic, has a cracked crust, and carries the mood of tradition without the long fermentation that gave traditional sourdough its character. Real sourdough takes time. Flour and water are held in a living culture of wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria. The dough rises slowly. Acids develop. Flavor deepens. Some compounds in the grain are altered. The bread becomes different from a rushed loaf in ways that are difficult to fake. But time is expensive in a fast food system. So industry often imitates the signal instead of preserving the process. It gives us sourness without waiting, color without aging, texture without patience, shelf life without life. This does not mean every modern food is harmful or every ancient food is better. That would be too simple, and history was never that clean. Ancient foods could spoil, fermentation could fail, contamination was real. People got sick from food long before factories existed. Modern food safety has saved lives and deserves respect. But something important happens when preservation becomes only sterilization. A food can become safer for transport while losing some of the living qualities that made it meaningful in traditional diets. Miso gives another example. A spoonful of miso stirred into warm broth carries a depth that comes from fermentation. But if miso is boiled aggressively, some of its more delicate qualities may be reduced. Traditional cooks often knew this without needing to explain it. They added miso near the end, letting it dissolve into heat rather than be conquered by it. Kombucha tells the same story in liquid form. Raw kombucha is a fermented tea shaped by bacteria and yeast. But if it is pasteurized for shelf stability, it becomes a different drink. It may still taste tart, it may still contain tea compounds and acids, but the living culture story has changed. Yogurt can change too. Some yogurt contains live and active cultures. Some is heat-treated after culturing. Some is thickened, sweetened, flavored, and turned into dessert, wearing the name of an ancient food. Again, the question is not whether it is good or bad in a moral sense. The question is whether it is the same thing our ancestors would have recognized. Often, it is not. And perhaps this is why so many people feel confused about food today. We inherit ancient words, but not always ancient methods. Bread, yogurt, pickles, cheese, vinegar, fermented vegetables, sourdough, broth, tea. The names are familiar. They carry emotional weight. They make us feel connected to something older. But behind the name, the process may have been completely redesigned for speed, uniformity, profit, and shelf stability. This is the hidden difference. A traditional food is not only a recipe, it is a relationship with time. When that relationship is removed, something changes, even if the label stays the same. Imagine an old kitchen at dawn. A clay bowl on a wooden table. A jar covered with cloth. Dough resting under a linen towel. Milk thickening slowly in the cool corner of the room. Vegetables weighted beneath brine. No one is rushing them. No one is asking them to behave like factory products. They are being watched, not forced. Now imagine the modern version. Flavor standardized. Texture corrected. Acidity adjusted. Cultures killed for stability. Colors preserved. Shipping optimized. The result may be convenient, safe, and affordable. But it is no longer the same conversation between food, microbes, air, temperature, and human attention. That conversation is what the ancient world knew, and it is what many people are quietly trying to recover. Not because we should abandon modern safety, not because old automatically means better, but because some forms of wisdom cannot survive when everything is rushed. Fermentation asks for patience. It asks us to wait long enough for transformation to happen. It asks us to notice small signs, bubbles rising, brine clouding, dough expanding, aroma changing, sharpness softening, sweetness becoming sour, hardness becoming tender. These signs are not defects, they are messages. They tell us that food is not a dead object. It is part of a living world, and for most of human history, the kitchen was one of the places where humans met that living world every day. This is why the difference between dead food and living food is not only nutritional, it is philosophical. A dead food system wants control above all else. It wants food to remain unchanged for as long as possible. It wants every jar to taste the same, every loaf to behave the same, every product to survive transport without surprise. A living food tradition accepts a small amount of unpredictability. It works with change instead of pretending change can be removed from nature. It knows that flavor deepens when time is allowed to participate. It knows that invisible life can be dangerous when ignored, but useful when understood. And somewhere between those two worlds, the modern person stands in the grocery aisle, holding a jar, trying to understand what the label is not saying. Was this food fermented or only flavored? Was it cultured or only thickened? Was it aged or only colored? Was it alive until the end, or was it made shelf-stable by removing the very thing that made it different? These are small questions, but they open a much larger one. If ancient people built whole food cultures around slow transformation, what else did they understand that we have mistaken for primitiveness? And that brings us to the final part of the journey. Because the most interesting thing about ancient fermented foods is not that they were old. It is that they were born from observation. Long before science had names for these processes, human beings were already listening. Number 7. What ancient people knew without knowing the words. The ancient world did not have microscopes. It did not have controlled trials, genome sequencing, microbiome mapping, nutritional databases, or laboratory instruments that could identify a bacterial strain by name. A mother stirring a pot of soured milk did not know the species living inside it. A baker feeding his starter before sunrise did not know which wild yeasts were rising through the dough. A farmer pressing cabbage beneath brine did not know that lactic acid bacteria were changing the environment drop by drop. A monk stirring miso into warm broth did not know the full chemistry of koji, amino acids, or enzymes. But they knew something. They knew what happened when food was rushed. They knew what happened when food was watched. They knew which smells meant life and which smells meant danger. They knew which textures meant a jar had gone wrong. They knew when dough felt awake under the hand. They knew when a cheese had aged into usefulness, and when milk had crossed the line into spoilage. They knew how the body felt after certain meals, and they remembered. That was their science. Not science in the modern formal sense, but observation repeated over generations. And it deserves respect, because before knowledge was written in journals, it was carried in hands. Hands salting vegetables, hands shaping dough, hands milking goats, hands lowering jars into cool earth, hands cutting bread, hands passing a spoon from one generation to the next. What we now call tradition was often data preserved through memory. A recipe survived because it worked often enough to be trusted. A method spread because it protected food from waste. A flavor became beloved because the body and the culture accepted it together. A morning bowl, a winter jar, a sour drink, a piece of aged cheese, a fermented paste, a living bread, these were not isolated discoveries. They were experiments repeated across centuries. Modern science does not make that wisdom less beautiful. It makes it more astonishing. Because now we can look back and see that many ancient practices had mechanisms hiding beneath them. Fermentation could help preserve food by creating acidic environments. It could make certain nutrients more available. It could produce compounds that affect flavor, digestion, and microbial ecology. It could reduce some anti-nutrients in grains and legumes. It could create foods that traveled better, lasted longer, and gave people more ways to survive uncertain seasons. The old world did not always know why, but it often knew how. And maybe that is the part we have lost most. Modern people know more about food than any generation before us, and yet many of us feel more confused than ever. We can read labels, track calories, measure macros, compare supplements, scan barcodes, and follow diets designed by strangers on screens. We can know the protein content of a meal and still feel disconnected from it. We can know the vitamin profile of a food and still not know where it came from, how it changed, who made it, or whether it belongs to any rhythm older than marketing. Ancient food was not perfect. There was hunger. There was disease. There was spoilage. There were mistakes. We should not romanticize the past, as if every clay jar held wisdom and every modern package holds harm. That would be dishonest. But we can admit that the past carried something we still need: attention. The ancient kitchen required attention because there was no other choice. You watched the weather, you watched the harvest, you watched the milk, you watched the dough, you watched the jar, you watched the appetite of the people you fed. You watched what lasted, what spoiled, what strengthened, what comforted, what returned year after year. Attention is slow. And slow things are difficult to sell. Perhaps this is why fermented foods feel so strange in the modern world. They resist speed. They do not fit perfectly into the logic of instant results. A sourdough starter must be fed. Kimchi changes as it ages. Kefir grains must be cared for. Miso deepens over months or years. Garlic and honey ask for weeks. A vegetable brine needs days before it becomes something more than salt water. These foods remind us that not all nourishment is immediate. Some nourishment is cultivated. And maybe that is the deeper reason ancient fermented foods are returning now. Not just because people want probiotics. Not just because gut health has become a modern obsession. Not just because science is studying the microbiome with new urgency. They are returning because people are tired of food that feels anonymous. They want food with memory. Food with process. Food with a trace of the human hand. Food that does not pretend to be timeless, but admits that time is part of its nature. A jar of fermented vegetables is humble. It will not solve a life. It will not replace medicine. It will not undo stress, sleeplessness, loneliness, or years of eating without attention. But it can teach a small lesson every time the lid is opened. Good things can happen in the dark. Transformation does not always look dramatic. Life is often quiet before it becomes visible. The same lesson lives in sourdough. A starter can look still and then suddenly rise. The same lesson lives in miso, darkening slowly in silence. The same lesson lives in cheese aging in a cave, in yogurt thickening overnight, in kimchi deepening underground, in vinegar forming beneath a floating mother. These are foods, yes, but they are also metaphors. They teach that the invisible world matters, that speed is not always improvement, That preservation does not have to mean lifelessness. That sourness can be a sign of maturity, not decay. That the old ways were not always backward simply because they were slow. And when we look at them this way, fermented foods become more than a category in nutrition. They become a conversation between human beings and time. A conversation we interrupted. A conversation we may still be able to resume. So perhaps the question is not whether every ancient fermented food belongs in every modern diet. Some people cannot tolerate them. Some need to avoid high-salt foods, histamine-rich foods, raw dairy, raw honey, strong acids, or specific ingredients. The wise path is always personal, careful, and informed. The better question is this: what would change if we treated food less like a product and more like a relationship? What would change if we stopped asking only how long something can sit on a shelf and started asking what kind of life it carried before it reached us? What would change if we brought back one small practice of patience? A spoonful of real yogurt, a slice of slow bread, a jar of vegetables under brine, a bowl of warm miso stirred gently at the end, a taste of something sour beside a heavy meal. Not as a cure, not as a trend, not as a promise, but as a reminder. The people before us did not know the word microbiome. They did not know the names of the invisible organisms moving through their food. They did not know the exact pathways by which acids, enzymes, fibers, and compounds might interact with the body. But they watched closely. They waited. They remembered. And in a world that has become very good at making food last longer by making it less alive, that old patience may be one of the most valuable ingredients we can bring back. Because maybe ancient people did not eat food that was still alive because they were primitive. Maybe they did it because, in ways we are only beginning to understand, they knew that life is often nourished by other forms of life. And maybe the quietest wisdom in the ancient kitchen was this: food was never meant to be only convenient. It was meant to be connected, to soil, to season, to hands, to memory, to the invisible world, and finally, to us. If this kind of ancient science and quiet food history speaks to you, you may want to subscribe for more slow, thoughtful journeys like this. And before you leave, look inside your own kitchen, not for something rare, expensive, or exotic. Just for one small food with a story behind it. A jar, a loaf, a bowl, a spoonful of something sour. Something patient. Something that reminds you that the old world was not always trying to defeat time. Sometimes it was learning how to taste. Number 8. Sourdough bread, the ancient loaf that learned to breathe before bread became something sealed in plastic, sliced by machines and made to stay soft for weeks. It was a living thing. It began in a bowl. Flour, water, a little warmth, a little patience. And then, quietly, the invisible world arrived. Wild yeasts drifted in from the air, from the grain, from the hands of the baker, from the wooden table that had seen 1,000 mornings before. Lactic acid bacteria settled into the mixture and began their slow work. The dough changed. It loosened. It rose. It became fragrant, tangy, alive. To an ancient baker, this was not chemistry. It was relationship. Every village had its way of making bread. Some baked on hot stones. Some used clay ovens. Some shaped flat cakes and pressed them close to the coals. Some carried a piece of old dough into the next batch, keeping yesterday's life alive inside tomorrow's meal. In the ancient Near East, bread was never just food. It was survival, hospitality, covenant, labor, and memory. A loaf placed before a guest meant welcome. Bread carried into the field meant strength for the day. Bread broken at the table meant that life, however difficult, was still being shared. But sourdough was different from rushed bread. It asked for time, and time changed the grain. Modern science now helps explain why traditional long fermentation matters. During a slow sourdough fermentation, wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria begin breaking down some of the carbohydrates in flour. They create organic acids that change the flavor and structure of the dough. They may help reduce phytic acid, a natural compound in grains that can bind minerals such as iron, zinc, and magnesium. Long fermentation may also alter some gluten proteins, which may make sourdough feel easier to digest for certain people compared with quickly made bread. But this needs to be said carefully. Sourdough is not safe for people with celiac disease unless it is specifically gluten-free. It is not a cure for gluten sensitivity. It does not turn bread into medicine. But compared with fast industrial bread, traditionally fermented sourdough is a very different food, shaped by time instead of speed. And that difference can be tasted. A true sourdough loaf has a crust that cracks softly under the knife. The inside is chewy, open, and fragrant. It tastes faintly sour, but not aggressively so. It carries depth. It carries patience. It carries the memory of grain that was not forced to become bread in a hurry. In an ancient kitchen, this kind of bread would have been ordinary, not luxurious, not branded, not placed behind glass as an artisan object. It would have been daily bread. A mother might have mixed dough before dawn. A baker might have fed his starter the night before. A traveler might have carried a dense loaf wrapped in cloth. A farmer might have eaten it with olives, cheese, yogurt, lentils, or a little oil. Bread was the center. But fermentation gave it soul. And perhaps that is why sourdough has returned so powerfully in the modern imagination. It is not just because people like the flavor. It is because sourdough makes time visible again. You can rush many things, but you cannot rush a living starter without changing what it is. That is the ancient lesson inside the loaf. The bread rises when it is ready, not when the clock demands it. And in a world that asks everything to move faster, there is something deeply human about a food that still refuses to hurry. Number 9. Miso. The quiet paste that carries 1,000 winters. In a quiet Japanese kitchen, before the day becomes loud, there is often a bowl of soup. Steam rises slowly. The broth is warm, not violent. A spoonful of miso dissolves into the liquid, clouding it with a deep, earthy color. Tofu may float near the surface. Seaweed softens. Green onion releases its sharp scent. The bowl is simple, but it carries centuries inside it. Miso is not a food that announces itself with drama. It waits. It begins with soybeans, salt, and koji, a culture traditionally grown on rice or barley. The koji helps break down the beans over time. Weeks can become months. Months can become years. The paste darkens. The flavor deepens. What began as a hard bean becomes something savory, complex, and almost mysterious. To modern science, miso is a fermented soybean paste rich in amino acids, enzymes, and compounds, created through microbial transformation. The fermentation process can reduce some of the compounds in soybeans that make minerals less available. It can create umami, the deep savory taste associated with glutamates. It can make a small spoonful powerful enough to flavor an entire bowl. But to traditional cooks, miso was something more practical. It was storage. It was nourishment that could survive seasons. It was a way to turn soybeans into something more digestible, more flavorful, and more useful in daily meals. This is one of the forgotten truths about many ancient fermented foods. They were not invented for abundance. They were invented for uncertainty. A harvest might be good, but winter was still coming. A family might have beans, grain, salt, and water, but they needed those ingredients to last. Fermentation turned temporary abundance into long-term food memory. Miso became part of that memory. The most interesting detail is how gently it is traditionally handled. In many kitchens, miso is added near the end of cooking, stirred into hot broth after the strongest boiling has passed. This is not only about taste. It also reflects an old respect for what fermentation has built. Heat can change delicate qualities, so the cook does not punish the paste. The cook invites it into warmth. There is wisdom in that. Not everything valuable should be boiled down, stripped, rushed, or forced. Some things should be added at the end. Miso also shows that fermented foods do not always need to be eaten in large amounts. A tablespoon in a bowl of broth can be enough to change the entire meal. It does not dominate. It deepens. That is the quiet power of miso. It teaches that ancient nutrition was often not about massive portions or extreme practices. It was about small, repeated acts. A bowl in the morning, a spoonful in broth. A flavor that returned every day until it became part of the body's rhythm. And maybe that is why miso feels so different from modern food trends. It does not ask to be worshipped. It simply asks to be remembered. Number 10. Kefir, the mountain drink, passed from hand to hand. High in the mountain regions between Europe and Asia, where roads were difficult and winters could be long, milk was too valuable to waste. Fresh milk is fragile. It changes quickly. Without refrigeration, it does not remain sweet for long. But ancient pastoral people did not look at this change only as a problem. They learned to guide it. From that world came kefir, a tart, slightly effervescent fermented milk made with kefir grains, which are not grains like wheat or barley, but living clusters of bacteria and yeast held together in a soft, pale matrix. They look almost like tiny pieces of cauliflower, strange, delicate, alive. A household that had kefir grains had more than an ingredient. It had a lineage. The grains could be passed from one family to another. They could be placed into fresh milk again and again. Each batch carried something from the batch before it. In this way, kefir was not simply made, it was continued. There is something beautiful about that. Modern people often buy food as isolated objects. Ancient people inherited processes. A starter, a culture, a vessel, a method, a smell that told them whether things were going well. Kefir belongs to this older world. Modern science has found that traditional kefir can contain a wide variety of bacteria and yeasts, depending on the grains and preparation. Some research suggests kefir may support digestive comfort for certain people and may be easier to tolerate than fresh milk because fermentation reduces some lactose. But the effects vary from person to person, and dairy-based kefir is not suitable for everyone. Still, the old logic is clear. Fermentation made milk more durable. It changed its taste. It made it useful in a world where wasting milk could mean losing precious nourishment. Imagine a shepherd returning at dusk. The animals are quiet. The air is cold. A skin bag or clay vessel holds milk that has thickened and sharpened through the day. It is poured into a bowl. It is shared with bread. It is not sweet like modern flavored yogurt. It is sour, alive, and practical. That sourness matters. Modern taste has been trained to expect sweetness everywhere, sweet drinks, sweet breakfasts, sweet yogurt, sweet sauces, sweet snacks. But many ancient foods were bitter, sour, salty, smoky, earthy, pungent, and fermented. They challenged the tongue because they came from survival, not entertainment. Kefir reminds us that nourishment does not always arrive as comfort. Sometimes it arrives as sharpness, a flavor that wakes the mouth, a drink that carries the mountain, the animal, the vessel, and the invisible culture inside it. And with kefir, the lesson is simple. Some foods are not created once. They are kept alive by being shared. Number 11. Yogurt and labneh, the soft food of shepherds and households. Long before yogurt became a brightly colored cup in a supermarket refrigerator, it was a way of protecting milk from waste. Across the ancient Near East, Central Asia, the Mediterranean, and parts of South Asia, milk was a daily gift and a daily problem. Goats, sheep, cows, and camels could provide nourishment, but fresh milk did not wait patiently in warm climates. It changed quickly. It soured. It thickened. It moved toward spoilage unless human hands guided the process. Yogurt was one of those guiding methods. Warm milk met culture. The vessel was covered. The liquid thickened overnight. By morning, it had become something new, tangy, cooling, smooth, and more stable than the milk that came before it. For pastoral people, this was not a luxury. It was common sense. Yogurt could be eaten with bread. It could cool spicy or heavy foods. It could be mixed with herbs. It could be strained into labneh, becoming thick enough to spread. It could be salted, rolled, dried, or stored in ways that helped households carry nourishment beyond the moment of milking. Labneh especially carries an ancient simplicity. Imagine a cloth bag hanging in the corner of a quiet kitchen. Whey drips slowly into a bowl. The yogurt inside thickens hour by hour until it becomes creamy and dense. Later, it may be spread on flatbread, touched with olive oil, sprinkled with herbs, and eaten in the morning light. No advertisement is needed. The food explains itself. Modern research has studied yogurt for its live cultures, protein, calcium, and its role in digestive health. Some yogurts with live and active cultures may support gut microbial balance as part of a varied diet. Fermented dairy can also be easier for some people to digest than fresh milk because bacteria consume part of the lactose during fermentation. But again, not all yogurt is the same. Some modern yogurt is closer to dessert. Sweetened heavily, flavored intensely, stabilized, thickened, and sometimes heat-treated after culturing. It may still be enjoyable, but it is not the same as the ancient food that quietly thickened in a warm vessel overnight. The difference is not only in the ingredient. It is in the intention. Ancient yogurt was not trying to be candy. It was trying to preserve milk, and this changes how we understand it. The old bowl of yogurt was humble. It did not promise transformation. It sat beside the meal, cooling, balancing, softening the edges of bread, lentils, herbs, and oil. It belonged to daily life, and that may be the reason it lasted across so many civilizations. The strongest food traditions are rarely built on excitement. They are built on usefulness. Yogurt endured because it was useful, because it was gentle, because it could take something fragile and give it another day of life. Number 12. Kimchi, the clay jar that held a season in Korea. Winter once arrived with a question. How do you keep vegetables alive when the fields are sleeping? The answer was not one jar. It was a ritual. Families gathered, cabbage was salted, radishes were cut, garlic, ginger, chili, and other seasonings were prepared. Hands moved together. Recipes carried the memory of mothers, grandmothers, regions, winters, and household preferences. Then the vegetables were packed into vessels and stored, often in traditional clay jars called ongi, where the cold earth helped control the pace of fermentation. Kimchi is not just a food, it is a calendar. It marks preparation before scarcity. It marks the intelligence of a people who learned to keep the taste of the field through months when the field itself was silent. The flavor is not shy. Kimchi is sour, spicy, salty, pungent, and alive. It does not try to disappear into a meal. It wakes the table. A small amount can change rice, soup, fish, noodles, or vegetables. It brings contrast. It brings heat. It brings the feeling that food is not only soft and comforting, but active. Modern science has studied kimchi for its lactic acid bacteria, fiber, garlic, ginger, chili compounds, and the way fermentation changes vegetables over time. Some research suggests traditionally fermented kimchi may support microbial diversity and digestive health as part of a balanced diet. Garlic contains prebiotic fibers that can feed certain beneficial bacteria. Chili contains capsaicin, which has been studied for its effects on metabolism and inflammation, though these effects depend heavily on dose, individual tolerance, and overall diet. But the real genius of kimchi may be its complexity. It is not one ingredient pretending to do everything. It is a system: vegetable, salt, spice, thyme, vessel, temperature, household memory. And this is what many modern interpretations of ancient food miss. Traditional foods were not isolated compounds. They were combinations, built slowly, adjusted by taste, repeated until they belonged. A jar of kimchi is not the same on day 1 as it is on day 10 or day 30. It continues to change. The sourness deepens. The texture shifts. The flavor grows rounder, sharper, more integrated. Some people prefer it young and crisp. Others prefer it older, stronger, ready for stews and soups. In this way, kimchi teaches something very old. Food does not have to be static to be trustworthy. It can have stages. It can mature. It can become different and still be good. And for a modern world obsessed with sameness, that may be one of kimchi's most important lessons. Not only that fermented vegetables may support the gut, not only that they carry live cultures when raw and properly prepared, but that food can be allowed to have a life cycle. It can begin fresh. It can deepen. It can become something else, and still belong at the table. Number 13. Sauerkraut, the winter cabbage that crossed oceans. There are few foods more humble than cabbage. It grows close to the earth. It is dense, pale, layered, and heavy in the hand. It does not look like treasure. It does not look like medicine. It does not look like something that could travel through history. And yet, when cabbage meets salt and thyme, it becomes one of the great survival foods of the human story. Sauerkraut is simple. Shredded cabbage, salt, pressure, brine, a vessel, a weight, a cool place, days or weeks of slow transformation. The cabbage softens, the flavor sharpens, the liquid turns cloudy. Lactic acid bacteria begin to transform the vegetable, creating the sourness that preserves it. What began as a seasonal crop becomes something that can last far beyond the harvest. Across Europe, fermented cabbage became a winter companion. It offered brightness during months when fresh vegetables were scarce. It could sit beside meat, potatoes, bread, sausage, fish, or grains. It cut through heaviness. It brought acidity. It brought the memory of the field into the cold season. And then it went to sea. Sailors understood, long before modern nutrition fully explained it, that certain preserved plant foods mattered on long voyages. Months at sea could damage the body in ways that seemed mysterious before the role of vitamin C was understood. Fermented cabbage, when properly prepared and preserved, helped carry some of that plant vitality across oceans. There is something cinematic about this. A wooden barrel below deck, salt air outside, dark water stretching in every direction. Men far from land, eating sour cabbage not because it was fashionable, but because survival often depends on ordinary things repeated faithfully. Modern science has identified raw sauerkraut as a source of lactic acid bacteria when it is unpasteurized, as well as fiber and plant compounds from cabbage. Fermentation may also make some nutrients more available and create organic acids that interact with digestion, but the key word is raw. A shelf-stable can of sauerkraut may still be food. It may still be sour cabbage. But if it has been heat-treated, it no longer carries the same living cultures as raw refrigerated sauerkraut. This is the difference ancient people would have understood through behavior, even if they did not know the microbiology. The living jar changes. The dead jar does not. Sauerkraut teaches that the most powerful foods are not always exotic. Sometimes they are made from the cheapest vegetable in the market, treated with enough care to become something enduring. Cabbage is ordinary. But ordinary things, given salt and thyme, can become astonishing. Number 14. Fermented garlic and honey, the amber jar of winter. There is a certain kind of preparation that feels older than writing. A jar on a shelf. Garlic cloves inside. Honey poured over them slowly until the cloves are covered in gold. The lid is closed loosely. The jar is turned from time to time. Days pass. Then weeks. The honey thins. The garlic softens. Bubbles rise. The sharpness mellows into something deeper, stranger, almost sweet. Fermented garlic and honey feels like something that would have belonged to a grandmother's winter shelf. Not because it was exotic, because it was useful. Garlic has been valued in many ancient cultures for its intensity. It was food, flavor, and folk remedy. Honey was one of the great treasures of the ancient world, prized for sweetness, preservation, and its ability to remain stable for long periods. Together, they form a preparation that sits somewhere between food tradition and household memory. Modern science has studied garlic for sulfur-containing compounds, including allicin, which forms when raw garlic is crushed or cut. Honey has been studied for antimicrobial properties, especially in medical-grade forms used in controlled settings. Raw honey also contains enzymes and compounds that differ from heavily processed honey. But homemade preparations require care. Raw honey should never be given to infants under 1 year old. Naturally fermented foods are not suitable for everyone, especially people who are pregnant, immunocompromised, or medically vulnerable. And garlic can interact with certain medications or irritate sensitive stomachs when eaten in large amounts. Ancient wisdom does not mean careless use. It means respectful use. A small amount. A careful jar. Clean hands. Good ingredients. Patience. Observation. That is the real lesson here. Fermented garlic and honey is powerful in flavor, but gentle in its pace. It does not become itself overnight. The garlic must surrender its harshness slowly. The honey must change around it. The jar must be watched, opened carefully, smelled, turned, given time. In a modern world built on instant remedies, there is something almost rebellious about a food that asks for 4 weeks before it is ready. No countdown timer. No quick result. Just a slow amber transformation in the corner of the kitchen. And maybe that is why this preparation still fascinates people. It feels like a memory from before the medicine cabinet became separate from the pantry, before every solution had a brand name. Before winter preparation disappeared from ordinary homes, it reminds us that food once carried responsibility. People prepared for seasons. They did not assume abundance would always be waiting. And in that preparation, they built rituals that were practical, beautiful, and deeply human. Number 15. Apple cider vinegar, the sour memory of the orchard. At the end of summer, an orchard is a place of abundance. Branches bend under the weight of apples. Some fruit is eaten fresh. Some is baked, some is dried, some falls to the ground and bruises. But in traditional kitchens, abundance was never allowed to remain only abundance. It had to be carried forward. Fermentation was one way to do that. Apple cider vinegar begins with fruit and thyme. The sugars in apples first ferment into alcohol. Then, with oxygen and acetic acid bacteria, that alcohol becomes vinegar. The result is sharp, sour, stable, and useful in countless ways. Vinegar belonged to ancient tables because it could do many things. It could brighten heavy food. It could preserve vegetables. It could be mixed with water. It could sharpen sauces. It could bring acidity to bread, greens, beans, fish, or meat. In some historical contexts, vinegar appears as a humble food of laborers, travelers, and soldiers, not as a luxury, but as a practical companion. Apple cider vinegar with the mother carries a visible reminder of this living process. The mother is the cloudy culture of bacteria and cellulose that forms during fermentation. It is not beautiful in the polished modern sense. It is stringy, strange, and alive-looking. But it tells you something happened here that was not merely manufactured. Modern research has explored vinegar, especially acetic acid, for its possible effects on post-meal blood sugar response when taken with carbohydrate-rich meals. Some studies suggest modest benefits in certain contexts. But vinegar is not a diabetes treatment, not a replacement for medication, and not suitable for everyone. People with reflux, ulcers, kidney disease, gastroparesis, or medication concerns should be cautious and speak with a qualified professional. And vinegar should always be diluted. Taken straight, it can irritate the throat and damage tooth enamel over time. The ancient table knew vinegar as part of food, mixed, dipped, diluted, blended into the meal. It was not usually consumed as a harsh challenge. That detail matters, because modern wellness often takes an old habit and makes it extreme. The old way was smaller. A splash. A dip. A spoonful in water. A sharp note beside bread. A preserved vegetable. A daily rhythm, not a dramatic intervention. Apple cider vinegar teaches that sourness has a place. It wakes up food. It slows the meal. It cuts richness. It reminds the tongue that not everything nourishing must be sweet. And perhaps that is one of the quiet losses of the modern diet. So much sweetness. So little sour. Ancient people knew the value of sour foods, because sourness often meant transformation. It meant fruit had become vinegar. Milk had become yogurt. Cabbage had become sauerkraut. Dough had become sourdough. The taste itself carried information. Sourness said, "Time has passed here. Something has changed." And sometimes, that change was useful. The old world was listening. When we look back at ancient fermented foods, it is tempting to turn them into legends, to say they healed everything, to say modern science has finally proven every tradition right, to say the old world had all the answers and the modern world has only mistakes. But that would not be honest. The truth is quieter and more interesting. Ancient people did not know everything. They lived with risks we would not want to return to. Foodborne illness was real. Scarcity was real. Spoilage was real. Many old practices survived because they worked, but not every old practice was safe or wise. And yet, inside these food traditions, there was a form of intelligence we should not dismiss, they observed. They watched milk become more digestible when cultured. They watched cabbage survive winter under brine. They watched bread rise when old dough was carried forward. They watched soybeans deepen through fermentation. They watched honey preserve. They watched vinegar sharpen a meal. They watched sour foods help balance heavy tables. They did not have our words, but they had attention. And attention may be the ingredient modern food culture has lost most completely. We have learned how to make food last longer on shelves, travel farther across oceans, taste the same in every city, and wait patiently under fluorescent lights without changing. These are real achievements, but in exchange, we sometimes forget that food is not only a product, it is a process. It comes from soil, weather, water, animals, microbes, hands, vessels, kitchens, memory, and time. Fermented foods make that process visible. A bubbling jar reminds us that life is still happening. A sourdough starter reminds us that yesterday can feed tomorrow. Miso reminds us that depth often comes slowly. Kimchi reminds us that a season can be held in a clay jar. Kefir reminds us that cultures survive by being shared. Vinegar reminds us that even fallen fruit can become useful. Garlic and honey remind us that winter wisdom often begins long before winter arrives. None of these foods are magic, but they are meaningful. They ask us to slow down, to notice, to taste the difference between something merely flavored and something transformed, to understand that convenience is valuable, but it is not the only value. The ancient kitchen was not perfect, but it was listening. Listening to the harvest, listening to the body, listening to the jar, listening to the quiet intelligence of the living world. And perhaps, after all our progress, that is one ancient skill worth learning again. Not to reject modern life, not to fear modern food, not to chase miracles in a spoonful of sauerkraut or a glass of kefir, but to remember that nourishment has always been more than calories. It is connection, to place, to season, to memory, to microbes, to patience, to the invisible life that has always been around us, working quietly, long before we knew its name. So the next time you see a jar of fermented vegetables, a bowl of yogurt, a loaf of real sourdough, a spoonful of miso, or a cloudy bottle of vinegar with the mother, do not only see a health trend. See an old conversation, one that began long before us, one that modern science is only beginning to translate, and one that may still have something gentle, humble, and deeply human to teach.